Welcome to the Nonfiction Writers, podcasting in a great way. I'm Ryan Aber, joined by Jason Kersey. Jason, how you doing today?
Good to be back on the podcast. We, what has been about a week since
a week since we had Andy Staples on, which was a fantastic time. If you haven't listened to it, please go give that a listen. But it's a new week and new stories popping up around the OU beat, and none more compelling than finally getting a chance to speak with Frank Shannon. Frank Shannon, of course, the OU linebacker who was suspended for a year, a little more than a year ago, from not only the football team but also just from school after a Title IX sexual assault investigation on an incident that he was not charged at all criminally for, but finally got a chance to speak with Frank Shannon.
Yeah, and it was it was surprising. I figured they'd probably make Frank available before they did Joe Mixon, but just because Frank has done this a lot, even though he took the last year off, he's dealt with us before, and I sort of expected that they would make him available eventually, but I didn't really think they would in the preseason, so I was a little bit surprised when I walked up and he was being brought over. So, I do have to commend Frank for being, I thought, very mature in the way he handled it. I mean, he probably didn't have to do it. I would imagine that if he would have told Mike Houck, the SID, that he didn't want to do it, they wouldn't have made him. And so, the fact that he did it and answered every question, he was friendly. He laughed a few times. He had a pretty good attitude, and I'm not sure that that's what I would have expected, honestly. And that's not saying anything. I'm not saying that he should have had a worse attitude or he should have had a good attitude or whatever. It's just sort of human nature. I would imagine that was not easy for him, but I sort of give him props for doing it and answering questions.
And let's lay all the cards out on the table, Jason. You were the one who broke the story that about the Title IX investigation, wrote a lot about it, went really deep into the report that led to the findings that led to him being suspended from school for a year, and followed up with not only Bob Stoops but David Bourne and Joe Castiglione and others. And what was that like for you, being there with Frank? And I know there had been discussions about talking with Frank at some point, and that never happened. But it's always an interesting dynamic as a reporter when you've broken a less than positive story about somebody or written less than positive things about someone, and then they're available and you have to stand there and make the decision whether to stand there and talk to them or let somebody else do it, or just how you navigate those things.
Yeah, it's one of those things that to be perfectly honest, it's not something I've necessarily looked forward to, I would say. I mean, I was the one that got the Title IX report and broke the news about why he was gone last spring when nobody really knew. And then I did a lot of follow-up reporting on that. I've written a lot of stories about Title IX, about Frank's court battle, and so I've asked a lot of people about it. I had an interview with the Title IX with the university's general counsel. I've interviewed David Bourne about it. I've interviewed Bob Stoops about it, like you said, and written a lot about it. And so you're right that and Frank has never been available to me all that time. Obviously, he wasn't enrolled in school. You're right. I did have a few back and forth messages on Facebook with Frank after the bowl game last year, and I thought it seemed like he was interested in talking then, but eventually he stopped responding, and I don't really blame him. I mean, that would have been sort of a risky thing for him to do. So I wanted to give him a chance to talk, but I never really expected that he would. But I would imagine that, considering a few months went by between when this alleged incident happened and when my story came out breaking the news of what he was accused of. Since all that time went by and nothing had come out, I would imagine that he probably knows that it was me that broke it, and probably knows that I've written a lot about it. So yeah, it was a little bit awkward coming face to face with him at first, but I first of all, I felt like I owed it to him and to everyone that if I'm going to be the one to break the news and write all those stories, that I need to be willing to stand there and let him say something to me if he wants to, I think that's a big part of being a reporter. You have to be willing to do that. And, you hear all the time about guys in Major League Baseball locker rooms who write stories, and then have to go up to that guy's locker and talk to him the next day. Well, this has been there's been some time between this, but it's still not something that, like I said, it's not especially enjoyable, but I have to give Frank credit for doing the interview and for being so friendly and kind with everybody. And he answered all of my questions. And really had a good attitude about it. So, I don't know what really happened in that apartment that night. I don't know whether he really did it or not. All I know is he's back with the team. It's my job to cover the team. And so when he is available, I'm going to ask him questions. And honestly, unless we go back and do some sort of story looking back on his year off or something, I don't really see any reason to bring it back up with him much. For a while, because I feel like they sort of got it out of the way now. And that's sort of, I've been rambling here for a while. I'm aware. I'm sorry. It's sort of a weird issue, but that's exactly why I think they should have made Joe Mixon available a long time ago. And I think they should as soon as possible, because the quicker they get him out there, the quicker it doesn't go away, and it might still come up some, but it's not going to be the focus of every question to him like it will the first time he's available, whether that's at a press conference to address that issue or after the first game he plays in.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely with you on that. I think that the quicker they would get Joe Mixon out there, the quicker the story would die. And I felt the same way about the video. And we're not going to go too deep in on the Joe Mixon stuff, but if the video would have come out the day that he had made the Alford plea, then there would have been a big story, and it was a big story when he pled, but it would have gone away reasonably quickly. Now, if that video ever comes out, and who knows if it will, my guess is that it will at some point, unless he just sort of fades into oblivion and we never hear from him again. But that doesn't look like that's going to happen. But whenever the video comes out, it's going to blow up and be another huge deal for a few days at least.
Yeah, I mean that's right. And so props to OU again for making him available, and props to Frank for coming out and talking. I think the sort of stipulation was that he was only going to answer football questions, but that's not how it ended up going down. I mean, he answered a lot of questions about the year off and things like that. The only time that any of us got cut off was when I tried to ask if after a prolonged court battle with the school, Frank maintains his innocence, if he has to fight any feelings of bitterness toward the school. And when I asked that question, Mike Hauk, the SID, who is doing a great job, I do have to say that. We really like Mike, but he stepped in and said, only football questions, and I get that. I had to ask it. I don't regret asking it. But Mike has a job to do too, and part of that job is making sure that Frank doesn't get too uncomfortable. And I could tell when I asked that question that Frank, I think he might have answered it if Mike had let him. But I understand why they cut that one off. So I actually give Mike credit for not cutting more questions off, especially if they wanted it to be football only.
Yeah, and including the one that preceded your question about whether or not he was bitter, which was what made you want to return?
That was my question too.
Yeah. Exactly. To which he answered, one thing I felt like, since I didn't do nothing or something like that, I just felt like I owed it to my teammates to come back and showed them, like, get in what I was supposed to get in while I was gone. Just be here with the team and help with the team and come back for Coach Kish and my linebacker brothers.
Yeah. That was the closest he came to, really, really defending himself in the original allegation. At the end of the interview, somewhere in there, he made a point that, he stood on the sideline because he felt like he had to stand up for what's right or something like that. But those are really the only times that he sort of teetered on that line that I'm sure he probably didn't want to cross. And, like I said, as far as I'm concerned, there's only two people that really know what happened. And so he's back on the team. It's our job to cover the team, and if he's going to play a lot. And so, like I said, as far as I'm concerned, he answered some questions about it. Unless we're doing a look-back story, sort of an in-depth profile about that, I don't really have a reason to ask him too much more about that, at least in the near future. So I give him credit for coming in, and there's really not much more to say about it at this point, I don't think.
Yeah, we'll stick with the topic of linebackers a little bit, though. There's been some shift on what the thought of what OU is going to do with the linebackers. Could they be in a 4-man front with just 3? Could they be in 3-3-5 a whole lot more than they've been the last couple of years? And with Frank Shannon getting added to a mix, you had Jordan Evans and Dominique Alexander that obviously played a ton last year in Frank's absence. There's going to be some squeeze on who's going to be able to play and how that rotation shakes out. How do you feel like Frank Shannon fits in as a player on this football team right now?
Well, that's going to be real interesting to see because I feel like Jordan Evans I thought played pretty well last year for the most part. He did, and he got bigger in the offseason, and that's the other thing.
That's something that I think Tim Kish talked a lot about today when we talked to him, and even a couple weeks ago when we got a chance to talk to him a little bit, was that how much Jordan Evans' illness before the season last year really affected him as far as his size, and they wanted him to get bigger, and it just took him a long time to finally be able to put some bulk on, but he's finally done that, and that could make him a even much more effective player than he was last year when he was pretty solid.
Yeah, and so I think that's going to be an interesting battle between Jordan Evans and Frank Shannon for that spot. But regardless of who starts, they're both going to play. They're both going to play a lot, I think. And right now, if I had to guess, I'd probably say that the two inside backers are going to be Dominique Alexander and Jordan Evans, at least to start out. But Frank has, he started every game on that Sugar Bowl champion team. He was the leading tackler that year. He was really good that year. He's also shown himself to be very capable of playing well in pass coverage, which is so important for linebackers when they're facing the sorts of offenses in the Big 12 that OU does. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Frank ends up starting this year. But whether he starts or not, the guy's going to play a lot. There's no question. And I think they're going to, he's on the team. They have to find a way to get him on the field.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. With as effective as he was a couple years ago, I mean, this is the leading tackler we're talking about. I think Dominique Alexander could be the guy who gets squeezed for some playing time a little bit, at least at some point. I know, obviously, he's dealing with a little bit of an injury right now. Not sure how long that'll keep him out. But to me, there's a good chance that we see Frank Shannon and Jordan Evans be the primary inside guys.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a possibility too. But, and there's been some criticism of Dominique Alexander, particularly against the run, last year. But, to me, I still think that, him and Evans were good enough last year to where they would deserve at least to start the season. But there's no doubt that Frank's a good player, and he's going to need to play.
Absolutely. And Tim Kish is a guy who's having a pretty good time recently. He was able to add Frank Shannon back to the mix, And then in recruiting, it seems like Kish has always been the guy that finishes second on a lot of these big guys. I know he got Ricky DeBerry last year, and that was a big get for him going, on the East Coast and picking up DeBerry. Was able to get Arthur McGinnis out of New Orleans. But the recruiting momentum he's picked up recently has just been phenomenal, picking up just recently a couple more linebackers to be able to add to that class and make a big impact.
Yeah, you're right. Kish did finish second on a lot of guys. It was like he guys really seemed to like him, but they weren't really ready to commit to him, and that seemed like a problem. And it there was a point, last year, at least in January, where I think a lot of people assumed that his job might be in jeopardy because of his lack of ability to land these top guys, and they seemed like they were a little thin at linebacker. They get Arthur McGinnis there at the end, but he didn't really. He wasn't the primary recruiter of Ricky DeBerry. That was Jerry Montgomery, and but it seems like he's picked up a lot of momentum, like you said, and certainly seems to be on a little bit of a roll here, and we'll see how that continues to go. But at this point, you got to be pretty impressed with the way he's recruited.
Yeah, no doubt about that. He was able to get John Michael Terry out of Victory Christian. That happened just a little bit after signing day. It was a little bit of surprise there that they made that run, but I think Terry's profile has picked up quite a bit since then. But really, just in the past 2 weeks, is able to get a 4-star guy out of California, Bryce Youngquist, who's pretty highly thought of out of Rancho Cucamonga, one of my favorite cities to say in the country. And then just last night, we're talking here on Tuesday afternoon, Monday night was able to get Pernell Jefferson to commit, a guy who was inside linebacker tandem with Arthur McGinnis last year and had a fantastic junior season at Warren Easton in New Orleans.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So that, these little victories are good for him, and at this point, there's no reason to believe the staff or that Bob Stoops is finished after this year or anything. I know we've sort of speculated about how that could happen, but I would assume right now that they'll be back, and if they're back and Kish continues to have this success, maybe things have really turned around for him, and it's so funny because he was the coach. Really, other than Heupel and Norvell, you sort of saw coming. But the next one in line, really, that I think most of us thought might not be back was Tim Kish, and it was all because of recruiting.
Yeah, absolutely, and he's really turned that around, and OU's really picked up recruiting momentum just in general recently. Just since since July 30th, they've gone down to Louisiana, got a couple guys, Chance Sylvie, the defensive back, Pernell Jefferson that we've already talked about. They got Parrish Cobb to commit from Waco. He's a guy who Baylor wanted. They get a guy out of Baylor's backyard. They haven't been winning many of those battles recently. They get Youngquist. So really since Logan Roberson from Hera committed in mid-June, OU's recruiting momentum has just been on a roll.
Yeah, and they've really picked it up because there was a point there in the middle of the summer when I think everybody sort of was like, what the heck is going on? They were not getting anybody. They were at, I can't remember how many commits they had at that point, but it wasn't very many. And you sort of wondered, how much do they really miss Jerry Montgomery? That was sort of what I was thinking.
They only had 4, after Ryan Parker committed in late April.
And what, they're 11 now? Is it 11?
Let's see.
10.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So yeah. My honest thought was that Jerry Montgomery was just being missed because he was so kind of their ace guy, and I still wonder about Dyron Reynolds. And I by all accounts he's going to be a pretty good technique coach and a good on the field coach, but the guy hasn't recruited in a long time, and the recruiting game is far, far different than it was. You look at Jerry Montgomery was always on Twitter, always interacting with guys. Well, we assume via DM, but he was tweeting all the time and tweeting out facts about OU and tweeting at current players and tweeting boom all the time, and you just don't see that with Tyron Reynolds, and you sort of wonder if he needs to sort of step up his game in that area, because that was one thing Montgomery was real good at, and social media matters to these kids. It just does.
And it also becomes more and more apparent when all of the other coaches are doing it and doing it well. I mean, it's amazing how far OU's coaching staff has come in the way that they interact online, the way that they interact on Twitter, and things like that, and the way that they represent themselves than they were really even just a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Well, yeah, when Bob's Twitter account was still private, and he was only trying to only use it for recruiting, sending, I guess, DMs and stuff like that. And it was just like they were very hesitant to embrace that. And once they did, they really sort of went all in with it. And Lincoln Riley's really good on that. I thought Jay Norvell wasn't bad at it. But Cale Gundy is real good on Twitter. I mean, they've really sort of embraced it, and it helps because here's the deal. I mean, you got to. You just have to these days. The only you always hear, well, Nick Saban doesn't tweet or do much with Twitter. Well, that's true, but he also sends a lot of people to the NFL. That's his recruiting. He doesn't have to do all that stuff. I mean, when he's sending as many people in the first, second rounds as he does, the NFL, you don't have to worry about it as much. I know OU's had a lot of guys drafted, but not on Alabama's level. And so if the talent ever slips or the NFL draft stuff ever slips for Alabama, that's when Nick Saban's going to have to get on board, and I don't know if he will.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to watch. We'll see if that happens anytime soon. But, Jason, one last topic just to touch on real quick is the suspension of Kenyon Freeson, the young offensive lineman we heard a lot of good things about over the offseason. Thought he might be in the mix for one of the tackle spots, especially maybe on the other side of Josiah St. John. But doesn't look like not only is that not going to happen, but there's a chance he might not return to the team.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that I was earlier when I did a phoner video with Jenny Carlson about this. I said, a lot of times when guys are indefinitely suspended, they don't usually come back. I mean, that's sort of a you don't hear about much. Jazz Reynolds was one. Trey Franks. I mean, there are obviously examples of guys who have been, quote, indefinitely suspended and come back, but that's a pretty tough path back, and it's hard for me to see him doing that, particularly if it's academics. Like, we don't know what it is. It could be drugs. It could be. I mean, there's any number of things it could be, but it sort of seems like it's probably an academic thing. If I had to, I'm totally speculating, but
yeah, that's what you would guess. But it's an interesting timing if it's an academic thing with the intercession still going on, I guess, or just ending, and the fall semester yet to begin. But how do you feel like that affects their offensive line depth? When you look, they've got some young guys, they've got some junior college guys, but not a whole lot of experience behind St. John and presumably Farniok right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the deal. They already were lacking in experience, especially at the tackle spots, and this this doesn't help when you don't have good experience. You want to have some good young talented depth, and that's not. And when you lose a guy like Freeson, who was a 4-star guy, a lot of people really saw potential in, that really hurts. They need some depth there at tackle. I was very interested yesterday at practice to hear Bill Bedenbow and Josiah St. John really talk up Drew Samia, the true freshman from California. Everybody sounds really impressed with him. So you don't hear often about tackles, at least at OU, playing as true freshmen much, but it sounds like he's going to have a shot. And then they've got Christian Daimler there, who's going to be I guess is he a redshirt sophomore this year? Yeah, I believe that's right, redshirt sophomore. So they've got some guys, but they just don't have that experience. And with a new offense and with the running backs that OU has. You'd like to think they'd be a little bit more solid up front. But here's the thing that people need to remember. Bill Bedenbow is a hell of an offensive line coach. He's really, really good offensive line coach. And if anybody's going to be able to get those guys going, it's going to be him. I mean, that's the a lot of times when you lose some of the talent they lost up front, you'd be real worried about it. I think OU fans can be a little less worried about it because of who the coach is.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Jamal Danley is another guy who could see some action in there at some spot. Not exactly sure where he would fit in, and then can't remember if you mentioned Orlando Brown, but
I completely
certainly
whiffed on him.
A physical specimen, if nothing else.
Yeah, no doubt, and I'm glad I can't believe I didn't think about him because he's obviously a big guy and is going to have a shot too to play a lot. But I always sort of thought, and I can't remember who said it. It might have been our buddy Bob Prisbillo from Scout. He covers the team as well and really gets into the recruiting far more than we do. And at the bowl game, I remember now it was him. At the bowl game, we were walking around on the field before the game, and those two, Friesen and Orlando Brown, walked out together. They weren't in their uniforms; they were just in their jerseys. And he made a comment about how he thought those two could be the next Thompson and Williams tackle duo. And so I mean that, and Bob knows his stuff when it comes to the recruiting stuff. So I have no reason to doubt that he really was a good player or is a good player, and they'd sure love to have him, I bet.
So, well, that's all the time we have for today. We unfortunately, Jason, don't have any time to talk quarterback play today, since I know we haven't touched on that very much recently.
Well, I mean, we'll get into it at some point. I mean, I don't know how our listeners will ever move on. I mean,
and I don't know how much they want to hear about quarterbacks at this point.
Who cares? I mean, that's not a very important position.
No, not at all.
Hey, if you want to hear about quarterbacks tonight,
Tuesday night,
I'm going to do my first Periscope live chat at night. I'm going to do it about 11 o'clock p.m. I'm stealing a page from my buddy Brandon Marcello, Auburn beat writer for AL.com. He's been doing that almost every night. I don't know if I got the energy to do that. But, I think it might be something I could turn into a regular thing. So get on there, ask some questions. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it should be. Definitely check out Jason on Periscope this evening. But after that, before that, check us out every day at newsok.com and tomorrow and every morning after it in the paper in the Oklahoman for the best OU coverage anywhere.